Welcome to another exciting edition of Words, Images, and Worlds. On this episode, I'm delighted to talk with an author who has traveled across many worlds and explored with genres, and this is author Dan E. Hendrickson. Dan, thank you for joining. May I call you Dan?
Yes, sure. Thanks, Jason. Can I call you Jason?
Well, of course,
All right.
absolutely,
Yeah.
absolutely. Well, we've been sort of just chatting through here before I hit record, and I know that you come from a lineage of storytelling. I always ask origins style questions, so I'm curious about what got you into the written word and authoring.
Well, my father was an English professor. He worked for the Sheridan College in Sheridan, Wyoming, and also he did work with the University of Wyoming. He was one of the most prolific readers I have ever known in my life. I mean, back in the 60s and the 70s, I don't know if you remember this, but there was a big speed reading craze where people would learn how to read a sentence at a time, then a paragraph at a time, then a whole page at a time. And my dad was one of the people that was enthusiastic about that. And I never really got uh, that down. I think I got to a sentence and then it started boggling me. But my dad, my brother and I would get books from bookstores or, homework assignments or from the library at school. We'd bring them home, and miraculously, my dad would read through those books within a day and a half. So he'd have something to talk to us about, especially the storybooks, the literature. And that just really encouraged me to get into reading a lot more because my dad loved talking to us about, the books that we were reading and the things that we were getting into, no matter what they were. Back then I was into high fantasy, fantasy fictions. I was into science fiction, still am today. Um, like to read that stuff, but my dad would just read it and he devoured it and he wanted to talk to us about it. And so that just got me into thinking about wanting to be a writer. My dad wrote poetry. He wrote a couple plays that got published and different things. And I wish he was alive today because he would have been my main editor. But he passed away back in 1991. But anyway, that's the biggest reasons I got into being an author was my father.
Yeah, lovely, lovely. Now you were talking about science fiction and fantasy there. What are the genres that you are enjoying exploring right now?
Well, right now, I'm reading a series called Sons of the Black Sword, and I can't remember the name of the author at this point, but it's a dystopian type future thing. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
Swords and sorcerers, and it's really interesting. Uh, for research, I'm reading stuff like a book called Gladius, which is I'm going to do a book about the first Gentile Christian, who's Cornelius in the book of Acts, and Acts chapter 10, and I'm reading about the life of a Roman soldier, and so this is that book that I'm reading there. I try to keep my reading, like I said, I'm not as prolific as my father, but I do try to keep my reading list heavy so that, I have a lot of material to grab onto and go with as I write.
Yeah, yeah. I love hearing about the research process. So anything that you'd like to say about that would be wonderful. And then I know that you have a background in journalism. So how has that come into play as a writer?
Well, when I was studying journalism at Casper College back in the 1980s, my main professor was a man named Dan Jones. He later on went to be a dean of Texas Tech. And he taught us to write in the third person present tense. And his philosophy was, and this was for newspaper writing, it's back in the 80s. His philosophy was that we are competing against television. And he said, when
Mm-hmm.
these guys get these television stories, they show you what's going on and they take you to the scene of the crime or the accident or whatever. He said that one of the things that we need to do is we need to compete with that as writers. And he said, in his opinion, third person, which is an omniscient view, you give all points of view, and then present tense puts as much as you can with the written word, your readers right into the action. And even back then, when I was studying journalism to write for a newspaper, I thought, wow, this would be a great way to write a book. And it wasn't that popular back then. It still isn't. It's a little bit more known today in literary circles, but most people write in, first person simple past tense. And
Hmm.
that's pretty much the way people write books. But third person present tense is starting to creep in. And I found that it really helps me with my books because I like to put a lot of action into them. So I like to put a lot, good fight scenes and different things. And I've gotten a lot of compliments, and especially with a lot of my action books, that they just feel like they're right there. And so I got to credit that to my professor in college, Dan Jones.
Nice, nice. I know that you explore subjects like historical piracy. You have exploration of the Magi, and so I know that you've done some research there as well. And it's interesting to think about biblical history and research as well. So, anything that you'd like to say about your connections there?
Well, I'm a Christian minister, have been since the early 80s. And one of the book that I'm kind of emphasizing right now, I published back in 2023. It's called Magi Apprentice. This is that
Hmm.
book. And Magi Apprentice is about the wise men that visited the child Jesus in Matthew chapter 2. And what it is, it's an attempt at a backstory of who these people were and how were they able to recognize the significance of his star and what it meant, and that it showed that the Messiah was born. And this is something I've been studying most of my life, as far as as far as the ministers going. There's a little known fact in the Christian world that I think needs to be expounded on a lot. And that is that before the Bible was written or put down in written form, before Moses received the revelation from God to write the first five books of the Bible, the God's word was reported as being written in the stars. And what that means is the meaning of the zodiac, the meaning of each star and each constellation has not a like from a Greek point of view, where they look at it as astrology, and where one star might mean how it affects your path as a person, and because you were born under like Taurus or uh, you know Libra or one of these other constellations, but these stars have significant biblical meanings. And what I saw is that when Alexander the Great invaded Persia back in the third century BC, he brought with him all the Greek interpretation of the zodiac. And that's where we get our modern day astrology, that you got Zeus, you got, Apollo, you got all this other stuff. And they felt that each of the signs of the zodiac helped determine the path of every individual that was born under that sign. Well, the ancient Eastern understanding of the stars had nothing to do with personal predestination or anything. It had everything to do with how the zodiac shows the promise of the coming Messiah, the coming champion that God promised in Genesis chapter 3, when he said he's going to smash the head of the serpent, he's going to destroy evil, and he's going to restore man back to his perfect paradise state. And that's what the zodiac shows, that whole path of God sending his Messiah, sending his promised one, and redeeming man. And each constellation, each sign in the zodiac, all 12 of them have different meanings to go to that. And so in Magi Apprentice, I use that premise to show that there were a group of men who in the East studied the stars faithfully. And one of the speculations is, and I think it's a pretty good one, is that when Daniel the prophet, who was sent to Nebuchadnezzar's court 600 years before the birth of Christ, he was the scholar that was put in charge of all the Eastern Magi under Nebuchadnezzar's empire. And it's really it's reasonable to assume that he would have taught these men what he understood about the biblical meaning of the zodiac. And for 600 years, some of these guys actually held on to that particular teaching. And when the proper conjunctions in the zodiac happened, they were able to recognize that it was actually the prophecy of the coming Messiah coming to pass at that point. And they watched these conjunctions and these configurations, and there were six of them between 3 BC and 2 BC. And they watched them to the point that they knew that the Messiah had come, and they put together a caravan, and they got safe passage from Phraates the Fourth and from the Roman government to go into Herod's court and get direction on where this Messiah was supposed to be born. And it's interesting to note that they knew that he was born, but they didn't know where he was born. The Judean scholars that studied the scriptures knew where he was supposed to be born, but they had lost the knowledge of looking at the stars like Daniel did, and so they didn't know that he was born. So, but they got in there, and then they were able to go visit the child. And so my story, Magi Apprentice, is a dramatization of that whole thing and bring it down to a personal level where I have this Parthian cavalry officer who's a young man. He's the son of one of the great generals of the Parthian Empire. So he has a lot of entourage into the whole Parthian aristocracy and stuff. But he meets a magi from Babylon that thought he saw the signs, but was mistaken, and was going to Jerusalem. But his caravan was attacked, and he'd been mortally wounded. Well, when Rasan, my main character, comes upon this guy, he'd already been visited by an angel who told him somebody named Rasan is going to come, and he's going to take you, he's going to take up your path. He's going to start doing what you're doing. He's going to take up your watch. So we had these sacred star charts, this magi that were penned by Daniel in my book, and he entrusted them to this cavalry officer. Says, please get these back to Babylon and give them to my successor, and so that he can continue to watch. So Rasan goes back to the court, and he gets safe passage all the way back to Babylon. And because he's so intrigued by everything that he's discovered, he becomes an apprentice at the Magi court in Babylon. And then throughout the book, he becomes integral in helping these guys get together a caravan that could actually go into Jerusalem and see what, it wasn't that easy in that day and
Mm-hmm.
time, because you got the Parthian Empire who were thrown out of Jerusalem by Herod the Great at the beginning of his reign. And he did that by using some of Mark Antony's troops from Egypt. And when he did that, he gained so much, popularity in Rome that Augustus Caesar awarded him the client kingdom of Judea. Um, he was not a Judean. He was from the Medea kingdom. He was a son of a Median princess, but he threw the Parthian Empire out. So why
Mm-hmm.
would a man like Herod let these guys come in and go see this child who these guys said is prophesied in the stars that he is going to be the ruler of the whole world? If anything, a guy like Herod would have taken these guys into captivity. He would have held them for ransom. He wouldn't have helped them. But something
Mm-hmm.
made it so he had to help him. So that's part of the drama of my book, is how did these guys get in there? Because there's really not anything specifically written. But if you just look at history and you just look at the culture at the time, you know that they would have had a tough time getting in there. They would have had to have the Parthian emperors leave. They'd also have to have the permission from high-ranking proconsuls of the Roman government that could tell Herod what to do. It was a pretty incredible process that would have made it available for these people to walk into his court and for him to help them. And then
Mm-hmm.
so there's the whole thing where Herod slaughtered the kids 2 years and younger after the wise man left another way. Well, that's another interesting story, because when Octavian, Augustus Caesar, was born 63 BC, there was a configuration in the stars that the Roman astrologers predicted showed the coming of a new Roman king. And at that time, that nobody in the Senate wanted a king. So there was a bunch of senators that got together and made a proclamation where they went out and they hunted down young children, 2 years and younger, and they slaughtered them because they were, Roman aristocracy that could lay claim to that opposed throne. A lot of people say that Herod used that information to justify his actions when he had all the children in Bethlehem slaughtered after Mary and Joseph got Jesus out of there. So that's also a
Wow.
good part of my book. So there's a lot of stuff there, in the whole little 3 or 4 verses in Matthew chapter 2 behind the scenes. It's just incredible. And you know, and from my understanding, they didn't follow some big glowing ball through the desert that just led them right to the house of Jesus. No, they didn't. They followed his star was, the conjunctions and the the whole astronomical, you know, dichotomy of everything working together so that they could understand that the Messiah was born. And they had to go to Jerusalem and find out where he was born. And that was in the scriptures, Bethlehem.
Yeah. Um, uh, you have such a command of history and biblical insight, and it's evident. If I was in your congregation, I would be learning a lot, I'm sure. Uh, I also like how you're thinking about the way that someone would experience this, kind of bringing that into the narrative form. Are there particular challenges there that you faced in kind of looking at the history and then thinking about those pieces in between? I imagine that's research. I imagine it's also prayer and consideration.
Oh, absolutely. I became very interested in this subject when I read this book. It's called Jesus
Mm,
Christ, Our Promised Seed by a man named Victor Paul Werwell. I read this back in 1984. And it shows, see, there are several speculations of when Jesus was born. One of the most popular today is a series of conjunctions that happened in Pisces in 7 BC. And that's where a lot of, like intellectual biblical scholars think that Jesus was born, was 7 BC. But what when you look at that and you look at the history, and especially stuff from like Josephus and from Antiquity of the Jews, he shows that there was a eclipse of the sun that happened really close to the time that Herod died. Well, the only eclipse that happened within, like even a 10-year period that could work with everything else that happened in the Bible is the eclipse that happened in 1 BC. And this, and so the 7 BC wouldn't work, but there were a series of configurations that happened in 3 BC in Leo from 3 BC to 2 BC that would work perfectly with the Magi following the 6 configurations all the way up until about July or August of 2 BC and deciding to put a caravan together. And as they put a
mhm.
caravan together, that caravan would have took several months to get there. It all works out with the Bible. They show up in December sometime, and there they are, petitioning Herod the Great where to go. And then, they go see the child, then they get the knowledge from God to go to a different place so that they're going to report back to Herod who this kid is. And then Joseph and Mary take the kid to Egypt. Well, then the eclipse happened like in our time, like early April of that year, and then Herod died right after that, and so that works, and so that's why this man, Dr. Worrell, and also a man who wrote The Star That Astonished the World. This guy's name is Ernest L. Martin. They both
Mhm.
agree that the one configuration of stars that would work, that would coincide and work perfectly with the scriptures, is the ones that happen in 3 BC and 2 BC. And so that's what my book uses, is that set of configurations. So yeah, no, Jesus wasn't born December 1st or December 25th, 1 AD, like everybody. And
Yeah.
most scholars know that today. They really do. But he was born, according to the interpretation of the stars and all that, actually September 11th, 3 BC, you know. And so the Christmas holiday really doesn't have a whole lot to do with the birth of Jesus, but a year and 4 months later, you got the Magi showing up and giving him gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh right around our Christmas time. So, I think that's
It
kind of
all
a cool
works out.
thing. Yeah, it kind of works out. And that's really where we get our present giving in modern Christian, Christmas is from the Magi giving the presents to the bed to the child Christ.
Yeah, yeah.
Um,
And I am also a Leo, so I like that interpretation. I like that particular configuration. Uh, some closeness there for me.
Yeah, Leos are very important. Like, from a biblical point of view, the astronomy, the zodiac has a beginning and the end. The beginning is the configuration Virgo, which is depicts the woman who will receive the seed and raise it, obviously Mary. And the end is Leo, where the seed of the woman conquers all evil and reigns forever as king of the universe, and that's Jesus.
Yeah.
That's our Christ. So it just, and that's the beginning and that's the end. So that works really well.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
I want to make sure that we tell people where to find the book and where to find more information about you. Before we do that, there's just such a rich biblical history here, and I've taught the Bible as literature. It's one of my favorite classes that I've ever had the chance to teach. I'm curious if you have a go-to verse or book of the Bible that you particularly like to study. You mentioned Matthew. And I know that the star configurations that goes all the way back to Job, which
Oh,
I
sure.
suppose is one of the oldest or the oldest book that's been collected. So just curious about where you enjoy exploring there.
Well, for the research of the book, obviously, Job, it's been speculated that, Moses did write Job, and that was his first writing before he wrote the first five books of the Bible. And Job has a lot of star mentions of stars and different things in it. If you pay attention, I mean, it doesn't give you like any specific interpretations, flat out. If you look at the context, you can kind of see what they're talking about. Like in the end, when God was reproving Job and tell him, can you read, can you lead about Cetus? Can you put a hook in his nose and lead him about? No, obviously not, because in the prophecy of the stars, it's the Messiah that's going to do that. He's the one that has the ability to do that. And we understand that, that's Christ. Someday Christ will completely put down, the devil, Satan, whatever you want to call him, put him in the stars. He's called Cetus and other things. He's a serpent. So there's some great stuff in Job. But if you want to look at a very simple, easy section of scripture that gives you God's plan for the stars and that his word is written in the stars, I suggest reading Psalm 19. It's only 14 verses. The first six talk about God's giving his whole plan of redemption of mankind by way of the Messiah in the stars, verses 1 through 6. And then verses 7 through 14 talk about the written Bible. And so that's all right there. And
Very
that's kind
lovely.
of the stepping stone that I use to study this stuff. And really honestly, because of the whole influx of Western culture into the East with the invasion of Alexander the Great, and then with the Roman conquests, and then you keep going with all the other different conquests that happened to the whole Persian lands. Uh, the whole knowledge of the understanding of the biblical understanding of the stars has been lost in a lot of ways. and it takes a lot to dig it back out. The two men that I feel that have really done a lot in this category was a man named E.W. Bullinger, who lived about 100 years ago. He wrote this book called Witness of the Stars. And he goes through
Mhm.
each constellation, each sign of the zodiac, and shows you the biblical meaning. You know, this is another man that this man, E.W. Bullinger, studied that lived about 150 years ago, is this guy named Joseph A. Seiss. And he
Mhm.
wrote The Gospel in the Stars. And so those are wonderful resources that I use to, help put this book together. But like I said, that first book, Jesus Christ, Our Promised Seed, written by Dr. Victor Paul Worrell, that's the one that really got my attention. It's an easy book to understand and read, and the whole stuff about the zodiac and the stars and all that. It took me a little while to ascertain it because I knew nothing about it when I first read it. I didn't understand. I didn't even understand astrology really, outside of what you read in the newspaper back then. But, after going through that a couple of times, I really saw the truth that, God, before he had Moses write down the first, you know, manuscripts of the Bible, he had already taught the first men how to understand his plan from the meanings of the stars.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think it was Aristotle once said, all truth is God's truth.
Mm.
Yeah. Well, it's been a wonderful and fascinating chat. Glad to chat with you and glad to share about your work. Where can people find out more about you? Where can they get copies of the material and kind of check out this book and the other ones that you've shared?
Oh, well, danehendrickson.com. That's my website. There's a lot of stuff on there, all about my books and different things. And, like I said, I'm not just a Christian historical fiction writer. I do a lot of action adventure. I do pirates. I do, military stuff like that. I have a very large background in martial arts. I've been a martial arts instructor on and off for like the last 35 years. So I got a lot of that in there. Um, and all my books are on Amazon. You can use my name to look them up. There's 9 books so far. There's one more coming out probably sometime next month. It's called Railroad Man's Legacy Son. It's all about the whole uh, history of the railroad going through northern Wyoming into Montana and the conflict that happened because they had to, petition uh, Indian tribes, especially the Crow
Mhm.
Nation in Sheridan of, laying a railroad line through their reservation. So there's a lot of fun in that book. Um, so that's coming out here pretty soon. But that's where they can find my books. Those different places. But my theme, my thing about writing is the fun is in the journey.
Mhm.
I think books take us on journeys. I love taking journeys with authors. I love seeing authors' different perspective of life and history and how to have fun. And I think every time we read a book, we go on a journey. So, and I invite people to come on a journey with me and with some of my books. And especially this time of year with, Christmas just right around the corner, take a look at Magi Apprentice and find out a little bit more about these wise men that visited the child Jesus in Matthew chapter 2.